In this video, we're going to talk about saving the data from an object that you create. So we have been talking more about classes and objects that get made from the class. When you do that, when you make a class, it can have multiple values stored inside of it, multiple methods stored inside of it. The values that you store inside of your class, or should I say that you define inside your class, are just variables, but when you define them, they're referred to as fields. The functions are just functions, but when you define them inside of a class, you refer to them as a method. Sometimes the fields are referred to as properties as well. So it's often said that a class has properties and methods. And that's what they're talking about. They're just talking about variables and functions in general. That's we'll fine-tune that definition going forward. So let me take this demo here and move it over and let's talk about it. So I've defined a new class called customer. We've seen this before. It simply is used to hold ID and name information, and the idea is that I'm going to make multiple customer objects. Now it's unfortunate that there is a class called object that you can inherit from, and it's the term object can refer to either the class or the object that you make from a class. So this here, where it says object, is a actual class that's built into Python called object, and I'm inheriting basic code from it. I don't know why they didn't call it like basic class or great parent class or super parent class or anything but object, but most languages do call that basic class the object class. But then you will also see people talk about, you take a customer class, so this, oops, wrong symbol. You take the customer class, still one. So if this represents the customer class, when you want to use it, you make up individual objects, and each object is individual. So this object would hold data for one customer, this object would hold data for another customer, and they would both exist at different address spaces. So like this one might exist at, I don't know, address 345, and this one might exist at, I don't know, address 17 or some crazy thing like that. But they'd be different objects in memory, even if they were based on the same class, which is customer. And then, as I said, it is kind of unfortunate, but there is a basic parent class called object that your code inherits from. So the code from the object class is, if there were two lines in the object class, when you use this syntax, you're basically copying those two lines over. Okay, those are supposed to look the same. And then you can add on more code. So I'd be adding on, like, ID would be added, name would be added, and then the toString method I made down here would be added as well. That would be addition to what I inherited from the original basic class called object. So it is somewhat fortunate that they call the basic class object, and then they talk about instances of the class as objects as well, but it's the way it is in the industry. It's going to be that way for a long time. Now you may notice that I'm going to go ahead and make a new method called toString, and I want that method to take the ID and the name and put a comma in between. It turns out that if you don't, you will inherit the underscore string from the basic object class. And we'll talk about inheritance coming up here. But for right now, just assume that I want to make a custom version of this so I can print it out the way I want it to. And that's pretty much the end of the class. Now to use it, I go through and make a new instance of it with this syntax. So here's my class. I go ahead and use parentheses, which seems kind of odd, but that's the way you do it. And I'll explain why later. Not in this module, but in a future module. And this will create an object for me. This will be an object in memory, which for all intents and purposes is if you had a copy of all the code in customers in a separate memory space. From there, I can go ahead and get data from the user, put the ID in, put the name in, and use toString to capture the data. This will extract it out in a comma separate value list, or comma separate string. If I wanted to make a list, I could use split. At that point, I can just go ahead and open the file and write to the file. I'll put a carriage return in there. And then when I want to read it, I'll read it. I guess I probably should strip it out, but it doesn't really matter too much. Let's give it a try. And you can see it's gone through and read the data and printed it out. Now I'm using the read function instead of the read line, and it's going through and just reading it all out with all the carriage returns and printing it all out at once. So it's reading everything. But then my file is kind of formatted in a format that I want. And again, if I wanted to split it, I could, but I'd have to go ahead and read the data first and then loop through it and split it. And then I'd end up with the format we saw earlier where we have a list of objects. So instead of read individual line and splitting it on the comma, I've just chose to print it out. But as you can see, this is kind of a nice feature, and I can control the way I work with the data inside of my objects by using methods to work with it. And that's a very common practice. You make methods to work with the data inside of your objects. We're going to be getting into the creation of classes in much more detail in future modules. So we've been introducing it slowly in previous modules, including this one, so that when we get to those chapters, it won't be such a shock. Okay, that's it for this video. I will see you in the next one. We're going to take a look at working with binary files.